Ahoy! Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, the new Borderlands title, is right around the corner and it needs to get a few things right. Yesterday I talked about why this fantasy standalone spin-off has the potential to become the best Borderlands game yet, but I also mentioned that quite a few conditions need to be met in order for that to happen. Some of these things are issues that were present at previous titles at launch and needed to be fixed later down the road or were never fixed, and some of them are introduced by the new mechanics and the new weapons, etc. For an introduction to Wonderlands as a whole, please refer back to yesterday's video. I will also link that at the end of this one. Now, let's get into what Wonderlands needs to get right. The first point is so obvious that we're just going to briefly touch it, which is optimization. Wonderlands has a much better chance of being decently optimized compared to Borderlands 3 because it's basically built on the same engine as far as I'm aware, but that doesn't mean that's going to launch perfect, and with how many people were driven away by the performance issues that Borderlands 3 initially had, this is something that definitely needs special focus in the beginning. Point number 2 is an issue that affected both the pre-sequel and Borderlands 3, and that is weapon farm and farmable bosses. Those need to be done well. In the pre-sequel, many of the bosses wouldn't even respawn after they were killed once, so you couldn't farm the weapons that they dropped, so that was obviously the worst approach. In Borderlands 3, on the other hand, a lot of the weapons at later stages basically almost entirely revolved around being anointed and having a specific anointed perk, which basically even made many variations of the legendary weapons pretty useless. We know that some form of anointed effects are still present on weapons, but we don't know how we can modify them this time, and we know that they will be less impactful in comparison based on what we've seen so far. So hopefully there's a larger variety of weapons that can be farmed in different fun ways. My third point plays into that a little bit, and that is the Chaos Chamber balance. Chaos Chambers, if you haven't watched yesterday's video, are a randomized endgame dungeon with different enemies, different level surroundings, all mixed together, different modifiers, so it'll be a unique experience every time you play it. As these seem to be a very fundamental aspect of the late game loop, they need to be done right. And there are obviously a lot of things that could go wrong here, right? There could be 2 debuffs that you get at the same time that suddenly make you deal no damage or something along those lines, or make you deal insane damage unintentionally. And while as a single player game this doesn't need to be perfectly balanced, obviously it shouldn't end up in a way where you can very easily farm very strong weapons by taking debuffs that actually all turn out to be buffs for you or something. My biggest concern is that because of the length of these Chaos Chambers, it may end up being more rewarding to reset the Chaos Chambers over and over until you get the right modifiers to run through them easily, rather than just finishing one run and going to the next one. So they need to make sure that there's a healthy balance here, that doesn't become the main thing. And on the topic of balance, let's go to point number 4, which is combat balance. What Borderlands has always struggled with is getting the damage output of weapons right versus the health of enemies and the amounts of enemies and clutter of enemies on the screen. In Borderlands 2, enemies just became massive bullet sponges over time, and in Borderlands 3 it was just an overload of effects, so you just played with your minimap instead. From what we're hearing so far, at least, clutter apparently doesn't seem to be a major concern. That has been downscaled quite a fair bit, but obviously this is something that can always go wrong in very late game. Health pools and damage output from weapons are another question, and we'll have to see about that one later down the line. I think the buff and debuff mechanics from the Chaos Chambers could be a good approach, but the question is how well that will translate over to the main game itself, where those won't be present. If you're enjoying the video so far and you'd like to support me making more Wonderlands content, please consider subscribing, clicking the bell, and maybe the like button. Now let's get to point number 5, making all playstyles viable. With Wonderlands, the playstyles between different characters and different builds will separate a lot more from what we've heard so far. You can go very heavy into melee, into spells, or into guns, or a combination of them. While this has always been the case in Borderlands, with the separation being stronger than before, it is really important that all playstyles retain a certain amount of viability. There are new features being introduced that aid this. For example, the Stabomancer has a ranged melee attack, which means you can take out enemies in the sky without using an actual ranged weapon, but this is something that needs to be consistent across most areas. Of course, it is completely fine if some enemies are easier or harder with certain builds. That's always been the case. What's important is that at the end of the day, every build feels rewarding and there is replay value with every build, so you don't feel like you're running the game with the best build once and then everything else doesn't feel fun afterwards. Point number 6 is a very different aspect. The writing and story of Wonderlands. Now, yesterday I talked about the writing having a lot of potential because they have acknowledged the shortcomings of it. But that doesn't mean it's gonna be easy to write a good story for Wonderlands. And it's not just about story writing. The story itself is maybe not even that important for many people. But writing is also about pacing of the game. So for example, you could have a segment where you have a 10-minute cutscene, or you could have a segment where you have an area where you drive around for 20 minutes and barely meet any enemies in the desert. Usually not exactly good writing. Part of this is also ensuring that the game is neither too long nor too short. Many people seem to be under the impression that this is just a DLC that they're trying to squeeze more money out of, so if Wonderlands ends up being extremely short, that would obviously not be a good look. At the same time, making games too long is also an issue these days, and if you don't believe me on that, just play through Assassin's Creed Valhalla once. A big component of the writing is also that we will no longer have predetermined characters. That is a nice addition in my opinion. I like the full character customization, but obviously they also won't have the same pre-written stories. You don't really have the same background anymore, and that is gonna create some difficulties, especially creating more lasting characters that would carry over to future games as well. You couldn't have had Lilith or Roland in Borderlands 2 if they never existed in Borderlands 1 in the first place. Point number 7 is waiting for dialogue. I know this kind of falls under writing as well, but this needs its own point when it comes to Borderlands specifically. It cannot be overemphasized how many times you end up waiting for dialogue, especially if there are like echo messages and stuff around, which there are a lot of in most Borderlands games, which then would overlap with the main story dialogue or side quest dialogue or whatever you're listening to. Matching the dialogue with the pace you go through areas is something that Borderlands has always struggled with. And this is especially frustrating if you're fighting through an area, the dialogue is going off, and then you get to the next area and it skips dialogue all of a sudden. I understand that not everyone cares about this, but for those who do care, this has always been somewhat of a sore aspect with the Borderlands series that could really easily be improved in various ways. Point number 8 are the humor and jokes. Which are, of course, very, very subjective. Some people will find things funny that others don't laugh about at all. That's always going to be a problem. But Borderlands 2 had kind of this feel for its time. It came out in 2012, which is peak meme humor time, and it fit right in there. It was very cringe humor at the same time, looking back if you're playing it now, but it worked when it came out. It also managed to tiptoe this line between some very tragic stories of the characters with this over-the-top humor. When you look into why characters like Handsome Jack, Creek, Tiny Tina or Tannis became the way they are now, it's very clear that often the story behind it is very dark and grim, and that takes a little bit more from Borderlands 1, but at the same time, in the whole setting of Borderlands, it's still gonna be turned into a joke somehow. And this carried over into the Tiny Tina DLC, into Assault on Dragon Keep, where you had Tiny Tina dealing with her own trauma in this way of playing this board game where she decides the rules based on her emotions in that moment essentially. And it fit in very, very well with the story of Borderlands 2. But there is a risk of this humor getting lost if the surrounding setting doesn't really exist anymore. You don't have this pre-story of Borderlands 2 building everything up before the DLC. You're just getting thrown into Tiny Tina's world this time, and something like having a more serious character like Roland being introduced kind of loses its novelty. Like, yeah, okay, he's serious and a kind of funny and absurd world. Yeah, we get that. That's only gonna work once. So I'm very curious to see if Wonderlands will be able to find its own humor and what direction it will be taken in. If they double down on the meme humor, even the millennial target audience will probably tire of it, but if they go for Zoomer TikTok humor, that will probably not appeal to a lot of people either. There are some really good signs here, like for example hiring the voice actor of BoJack Horseman for the role of the main villain is an extremely high potential hire, but the question is if it's going to be used that way. Adding on to this point is point number 9, the tabletop or Dungeons and Dragons or Bunkers and Badasses theme. There's a very significant overlap of tabletop players and gamers in general, just this whole nerd culture thing, so there is a good reach through that. But not everyone who plays Borderlands is also a tabletop fan. I, for example, am not one. Assault on Dragon Keep managed a very nice balance between tabletop humor, World of Warcraft or MMO in general references, and other humor, whereas based on what I've seen so far about Wonderlands, it really doubles down on the tabletop part of that specifically. So my concern is by creating this niche, they may alienate some of the normal Borderlands theme fans and maybe not attract all too many tabletop players. We'll have to wait and see how much that is actually going to be the reality, but I hope that they still dedicate a significant portion of the game to a general audience that doesn't just have appeal to tabletop players. Point number 10 is an aspect that I'm really hoping they will improve upon, but I'm worried they probably didn't, and that's inventory management. The inventory UI seems to be very clearly designed with console in mind, because Borderlands has a pretty large console audience, which is fine, but it would be great to have a PC layout that is more optimized for mouse and keyboard, because it's kind of inconvenient, to be honest. It wouldn't be the end of the world if there are no improvements here, since most other aspects of Borderlands are usually pretty decently optimized on PC, but hopefully this is something they look at least in the future. Bonus point number 11 is marketing. While this doesn't affect in-game, I think it's very important that Wonderlands gets the marketing for the game right. At this point, I've seen very little marketing for the game, even though it's coming out soon, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to market it. Some games these days just start marketing the moment that the game is launched and not before that. But they also need to be very clear about this not being a DLC but its own standalone game, and that is something that needs to come across in the marketing, because at this point I know many people still think that Wonderlands is just a DLC. So I really hope they roll out an aggressive marketing campaign to make that very clear at the start when the game launches. Now if you want to know more about why I think Wonderlands may become the best Borderlands entry, I will link that video in the corner right here. In the next days we'll dig deeper about some overall info and some lesser known things about Wonderlands, and I'll also talk about skill trees and so on. If you'd like to see that, please consider subscribing, clicking the bell, maybe clicking all notifications, so that you get notified when those videos come out. If you enjoyed this, caress that like button. Thank you very much for watching, I hope to see you for the next one soon. Dukesloth, out.